So welcome, everyone, to the Dorsey IFA Franchise Business Network meeting, also known as the FBN. My name is Josh Piper, and I will be your host today. I am a senior attorney in the franchise practice group here at Dorsey. I practice almost exclusively in franchise law and related areas. Joining me in the room here today is Gary Duvall, who's in our group, who most of you know. I'd also like to introduce Danelle Wolf. Danelle, you want to raise your hand? Danelle joined us late last year as a staff attorney in our group, so we're very happy to have her with us. And we have about 20 folks here in the room and a similar amount joining us online, so it's very encouraging to see a good turnout for our event. One housekeeping matter on questions. If you're here live in the room, feel free to raise your hand at any time, ask a question. Those of us on the panel will try to remember to repeat it into the microphones for the people online. And if you're one of the web participants, you can submit a question on the chat feature, and we'll, unfortunately, we can't get to them during the presentation, but we'll follow up by email. Our topic today is franchise financing. However, while everyone is finishing up their lunches, grabbing their cookies and their coffee, I did want to have a couple of preliminary items on the agenda to talk about. A local member spotlight, and then a brief legal update. And before we get to those, I also wanted to take a minute to remind all of us that these FBN meetings, we host them in conjunction with the International Franchise Association, the IFA, which we are a member. I'm sure many people in this room and online are also members. And if you're not familiar with the IBA, haven't been involved, it's really an incredible industry organization. There really is no better place than the IFA convention or the other IFA events to deepen your knowledge about all aspects of franchising and to make really good connections within the industry. Not to mention all the work they do at the grassroots level and on the legislative level, confronting some of the misperceptions and misguided threats to the industry. So this is sort of a pitch to get involved with the IFA. If you're in the industry or thinking about it and aren't a member of the IFA, I'm on the membership committee. I'm happy to talk to you more about it after the meeting or by email. It's my privilege to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Amy Holland, who leads the SBA loan department at Guidant Financial, where she helps guide entrepreneurs through the most stressful part of opening a small business, the financing. Allison Zoritz next to her, who is the National Business Development Manager at Guidant Financial, where she is responsible for managing accounts and creating lasting partnerships with key executives in the franchise industry. So you work, I think, a lot with franchisors, right, Allison? Yeah. And at the end, Michael Esfeld, Vice President and Business Development Officer at Umpqua Bank, who's been specializing in SBA financing for over 29 years. I'd like to take a quick second now to remind us all about one of the primary purposes of these FBN meetings, and that is to provide an opportunity for those of us in the industry, in this region, to get together in an informal way, to exchange ideas, best practices, to make connections. And the goal is really to cultivate and support our regional franchise industry. And I think sometimes we might not be aware of who is in the region, who is involved in the industry. So I wanted to give Allison just a couple of minutes to talk about Guidant Financial, who does a lot of work in the franchise industry. It's kind of like a local IFI member spotlight. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Guidant, they're a major player in franchising, and we're quite lucky to have them right here in our backyard, right across the lake over in Bellevue. Allison?
Hi, everybody. I'm Allison. Just a little overview on Guidant Financial for those of you that don't know who we are or haven't heard of us. We've been around since 2003. We were actually founded by two entrepreneurs themselves, David Nilsson and Jeremy Ames. Literally started the company with $20,000 and a laptop, and have since grown it to be the leading industry provider for small business and franchise ownership. So we are just across the lake, as Josh said, in Bellevue, Washington. We've got just over 100 employees in that same office, which makes us very accessible and very unique that we're all under the same roof, which we really appreciate daily. And we're still a privately held company. In the last 14 years, Guidance helped roughly 14,000 entrepreneurs open their doors to small business and franchise ownership by accessing over $4 billion in capital and in return creating more than 80,000 American jobs, which just to put that in perspective, that's more employees that Amazon or Nordstrom's employees. So we're very happy to be giving back to the community and love seeing it grow. Guidant averages about 150 transactions a month. We do about 2,200 a year, somewhere in that range. So being a full suite of solutions has definitely made us probably stand out in the industry because we can offer such a wide range of financing solutions to candidates. And specifically what we do differently than I think most is, for instance, if you were going to go to Prosper or something along those lines, they really put you into one loan, and they basically change the interest rate. What Guidant tries to do is actually take that customer and really educate them on anything that could be applicable to their situation and then base the solutions around what they're looking to do. So not trying to cram them into a ROBS, which is the rollover for business startup, but really understand what their short and long-term goals are so that we're not exhausting all their capital right out of the gate, but really making them successful at year 1, 5, and 10, and so on down the road. So that's really Guidant.
And one quick follow-up question is, of those 150 transactions, do you have an idea of what percentage are franchise deals?
Yeah, we usually say that about 60% of those are franchise opportunities. So when we look at the 2,100 transactions we did last year, about 60% of that was franchise versus small business.
That's a lot. Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'll just take a few minutes here on, since we made you come to a law firm, give you a little bit of update on some legal issues that have come up in the last 4 or 5 months. There's always legal issues coming up, but these are some of the big ones that have popped up recently. I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but the first is Item 19, Financial Performance Representations, and a new commentary that was adopted actually just this month by the North American Securities Administrators Association, or NASA, or Nassau, depending on how you pronounce it. And if you're not familiar with Nassau, they're the group that puts out rules that the state regulators follow and guidelines for when they're evaluating and registering FDDs. They've put out commentaries on other parts of the FDD, and this one is specific to Item 19s and financial performance representations. There's a lot of elements to it. Some of them are kind of straightforward, easy to implement. For example, if you include an average in your Item 19, you have to now include the median as well. If you report a subset of high performers, you now have to report a corresponding subset of low performers. But perhaps the biggest change, or the one that's been most controversial, are around strict limitations on using company outlet data in making financial performance representations. And the upshot there is, if you have even one operational franchised outlet that has been operating for at least 12 months, you must include those franchised outlets in your FPR. You cannot strictly report company-owned outlet data. And this is particularly a challenge for emerging franchisors because they often will have only company-owned outlets and maybe just a couple that are franchise outlets that are coming online. So it puts them in a bind as to how to report that data. Again, there's a lot more to it, but if you have an Item 19 in your FDD and you're reporting, making an FPR, if you haven't already, you should be in touch with your legal counsel to make sure there's what changes there might be necessary. So that's first. Second, for those that aren't aware, our good neighbors to the north in British Columbia now have a new franchise law. If you've been in the loop, this is not new. It's kind of been in the works for a while, but it did actually just become effective February 1st of this year. It appears to be very similar to the other provincial franchise laws, although I'm not a Canadian lawyer, and I'm sure there are critical differences. But if you are selling in Canada or thinking about it, make sure you're talking to Canadian franchise lawyers about those new laws. Phyllis. So the question was, if you have affiliates up in Canada who are selling, where should they go for information. And yeah, any of the Canadian franchise lawyers, especially those located in British Columbia, we have contacts with a few and can give those to you. Yeah. Gary.
Canadian franchise community has an association, Canadian franchise counterpart to the IFA. They have a website, IFA.ca,
Yeah. And just to recap for those online, the comment was the Canadian Franchise Association has a website that lists lawyers that are members of that association, which is a good resource. And then finally, a topic that will segue into our main topic, changes to the SBA's Standard Operating Procedures, or SOP. And so late last year, the SBA put out a new SOP, which is sort of their internal process about how they process franchise loans. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what went on there, and part of that involves sort of backing up and understanding the unique relationship between the SBA and franchising and how that came about. And the key word in that unique relationship is affiliation. So the SBA's goal and mission is to support small businesses, and the decades ago, concern came about that the franchising model might be used to mask a large business by breaking it up into smaller businesses, and thereby the SBA would inadvertently be supporting a large business rather than a small business. And so this word affiliation is if businesses are, quote, affiliated, the SBA treats them together and lumps all their assets and everything together when determining if they're small. And so as this evolved, the solution came around that franchise systems would negotiate with the SBA to prepare an addendum to their franchise agreement that would limit some of the franchisor controls that the SBA was especially concerned about with respect to this affiliation standard. And so franchisors spent a lot of time and money every year negotiating this addendum. The SBA maintained a registry of franchise systems that were vetted and approved and went through this whole process. And so it was very easy for lenders and others to find out, okay, if I need financing, I can use this system. The SBA has vetted them and they're okay. So it involved a lot of work on the SBA side. And last year, the SBA was seeking to streamline its internal processes and put out a new SOP that basically did away with almost all of that. Part of that SOP is a new uniform addendum to be attached to a franchise agreement that they will not negotiate. It covers the 4 items that are listed there on the slide. They no longer maintain their own registry of what systems are vetted. They've sort of pushed that obligation down to lenders. And there was sort of some upheaval at the time this came out among lenders and franchisors. Lenders were concerned about having to make that determination on whether franchise systems should be vetted and would qualify for SBA guarantees. And lenders who had spent a lot of time and money negotiating their own specifically tailored addendum weren't really happy with having to sign this take it or leave it approach with the SBA addendum. So the SBA, to their credit, listened to some of that and issued an amended SOP in the spring where they allowed franchisors who had negotiated an addendum in 2015 or 16 to use that as long as they certify that their franchise agreement hasn't changed in material ways for those items that the addendum applies to. So that helps those franchisors, but if you're a new franchisor or you never went through the process, it's still, for those folks, kind of a take it or leave it approach with this mandatory uniform addendum that limits the franchisor controls around these 4 areas. If there's changes in ownership among the franchisor, franchisee, if there's a forced sale of the assets, how that gets valuated. Franchisors can't put covenants on real property that's involved, and then you can't control employees, which almost no franchisors should be doing. So the last point is that to stay tuned. These SOPs are not static. They're not rules that require a lot of public disclosure and comment period to change. The SBA can change them at will, so it's possible this could all change tomorrow or next year. So with that, I'm going to move down to the table. And start our panel. So I think a lot of us in the room are familiar with SBA financing, but I think there are some who aren't, and online. So I was wondering, Amy, if I'm new to the game, what do I need to know about the basics of SBA financing and how it works?
I would say the basics of SBA financing, there's some guidelines set by the SBA, but typically they're not the ones that are going to actually be lending you the money. So we're working with banks who create their own credit box inside of the guidelines that the SBA set. So SBA says, loans up to $5 million. They want to see certain debt service coverage ratios. They want to see certain collateral requirements. And then the bank will take that and they'll create their own credit box inside of that for what they're comfortable lending to internally. So we see a lot of gray area when it comes to SBA lending because the SBA sets a pretty low floor, but then the banks will jump on top of that and set their own credit box. And you may have somebody who goes to one bank, tries to get a loan through them, and gets declined through that bank. That doesn't necessarily mean that they won't qualify for any SBA loan. They might just be working with the wrong bank. So in terms of SBA financing, you'll want to understand the basics around the SBA guidelines around eligibility, credit, collateral requirements, things like that, and I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But the other basic to understand is really that these are individual banks who have their lending guidelines that are going to sit on top of those SBA guidelines, and that may differ pretty clearly from what the SBA sets for.
Great. So I think for those that don't know, the SBA is really heavily involved in franchise financing, and I think the fact that they're willing to guarantee these loans for banks is a big part of that. Does maybe Amy or Mike, do you guys know, does the SBA, in light of their new process, are there other standards that they're looking at for vetting franchisors?
The addendum covers those 4 items, but there's more than that. So they are still looking at what does this franchise do as a whole, and does that align with the SBA guidelines? So things like not being discriminatory. Does this franchise offer services to both men and women? Or is it something like a barbershop that may only offer services for men, or something like a women's gym who only offers services to women? These are items that, even if they sign off on that addendum, may still not qualify for SBA financing. So there's definitely items that they'll want to understand in terms of the overall function of the franchise and what they're looking to do to make sure that that aligns with the goal of the SBA program, which is to have entrepreneurs offering services really to everybody out there rather than nailing it down into one specific demographic.
And banks, of course, may do and will do their own due diligence with regard to a particular franchisor to review their financial strength, history, et cetera. And so there again, to Amy's point, you may find that certain lenders have a wider tolerance, for example, to taking more risk with a newer type of franchisor versus those that are more well established. So that due diligence is also up to the bank to determine the strength of the franchisor, which obviously affects the ability of a franchisee to obtain financing.
And that sort of segues or jumps into the next topic, which would be if there's lender standards for franchisors. And I'm curious if I talked about sort of the changes at the SBA and how they're pushing some of that vetting down to banks. Have you guys in your interactions, or Mike, with lenders had feedback on how they're handling that and their response to having to deal with that instead of relying on the SBA to do it?
Yeah, on our end, where we've seen it impact the most is these newer kind of emerging franchise brands and certain lenders, not all, being a little bit more conservative in their approach to jump in to do the work to review that franchise agreement, that FDD, to make sure that it's going to meet the guidelines, and they may just say that they're not interested in taking on that business and would prefer to work with a brand that's a little bit more established. So that's the one area that we've seen really any negative impact, and it's not across the board. It's really just certain banks being a little bit more conservative on what they want to take on, just because more of the risk now falls on them.
Great. Maybe one more follow-up from me. So the SBA maintained this list called the Registry, which was outsourced to FranData. Is that, so now that the SBA is no longer requiring it, is that, what's going on with that registry, or are banks still using it, or is it still around?
So banks are still checking the registry. They would love to know if this franchise was approved in the past, because that's a really good indication that they're going to still be approved now, and that there's a lot less risk in signing that. FranData is also maintaining, or plans to maintain, a list of whether or not a franchise plans to sign that addendum, so that banks can reference that to know that this is a franchise who's thought about the addendum and is okay with signing it before they get too far down the road with that. So they're still utilizing the registry. It's been something that they've relied very heavily on, so the transition will be kind of interesting to see if that falls off the more the addendum becomes part of practice, or if FranData maintains a big presence. At this point, we just don't really know, but it will be interesting to see what that transition looks like.
It's also, I think, the intent of the SBA to want to maintain some sort of registry just for ease, and so lenders aren't constantly going through a bunch of hoops to determine whether someone is eligible or not. That's at least the intent, so we'll see how that works out.
And so on the same topic, Mike, I know you deal a lot with existing business acquisition financing, so resales of existing franchises are always big. From a lender perspective on vetting a system, if there's somebody out there who's looking to buy an existing franchise system, I think you talked a little bit about how the bank might look at the franchisor and the franchise system. Do you have any other thoughts or comments on how, in a resale, is there any process that changes from your end on whether it's you're dealing with a franchise resale versus just somebody out there buying any other business?
Well, there's no question that the franchise aspect adds value. I think it depends on who the franchisor is and the like. I think the basic credit guidelines are pretty much the same, and we can talk about that in a while if you'd like. But it's kind of an indication of the difference between one bank and another. I'll give you an example from our perspective. We will do franchise startups, but we're looking for outside cash flow, outside income, spousal income, et cetera, in order to support the debt rather than just a ground zero scenario. And so perhaps that is a bit more conservative, I think prudent, but a bit more conservative than a lender that's just willing to jump in on a pure startup where someone simply has an injection and they're hoping on the success of the business to support their debt and themselves. So, that's an example, maybe one nuance in the difference.
Some franchisees don't need a business loan. They don't need the SBA because their partner has some adequate funds or in their home or a retirement plan. Allison, how can a franchisee use retirement funds to fund a franchise?
Yeah, so the acronym ROBS, which I think is hysterical that the IRS nicknamed it ROBS, but it stands for Rollover for Business Startup. And so that allows entrepreneurs to utilize their retirement funds tax and penalty-free to start their own small business or franchise. And how they do that is simply by establishing a new 401k. They then establish a C Corp, open up a business account, and then simply purchase stock in their own business via a stock purchase. We issued them shares in the amount of $1 million. It's really a simple 4-step process that our company holds their hand through the process and makes sure that we're, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, because the IRS definitely has very strict structural and operational requirements that go behind this setup. And so we actually have a back end as well that will work with these clients monthly to ensure that they're not throwing up any red flags to the IRS. But it's a very simple process. Just 2 things you need to remember is that that client needs to have left the employer that controls those funds in order to have access to them, and that we also do not, we can't work with any Roth. So those are the only 2 exclusions that go with the Roth structure. And that's from an ERISA tax law that's actually been around since 1974. So it's a great setup. It's just about education and getting it out there to people, letting them know that it's really an adequate way to start your business with no debt.
And has there been any talk, or is it pretty well-established system and program now? There's no talk among regulators or lawmakers that it's somehow abusive or,
Yeah, not since 2009, knock on wood. We haven't really had any issues since the memorandum that came out in 2009. But, there's always talk that goes around whether shutting down retirement funds to purchase a business is going to happen. I don't see it happening. We haven't heard anything lately, so it's obviously a very viable solution to go forward with. It's just, I think our biggest thing is a lot of people don't even know that you can do it. So while Guidant is really known to be the ROBS provider, if I were at a conference right now and talking to people off the street, they'd be like, I had no idea I could even do that. So it comes back to that education piece of just, our team and our company and others like us that are out there in the space, making sure that everybody knows it really is a true viable option to open your doors with no debt at all.
Great. So Amy, for franchisees that use this retirement fund for funding, but they also might need an SBA loan, how do those 2 interface with each other?
They work beautifully together. Lenders love having a borrower come in with their retirement funds, because it typically means that using your retirement funds as your down payment is going to preserve your personal liquidity, so the cash you have in maybe your checking account. So being able to utilize the retirement accounts, probably about 40% of the people I work with day to day are using the Roth structure as their down payment for their SBA loan. It works beautifully together. There's no, legality around not being able to. There's a simple SBA waiver that our company helps to put together and other companies help to put together that says basically the 401k plan that's now an owner of this business can't guarantee the SBA loan. But outside of that, there's really no issues, and lenders love to see that they're able to use this retirement account, again, to preserve the liquidity that they have personally. And it's something that we do every day. Works great.
Cool. And a follow-up question, what about integrating SBA financing with other options beyond ROBS, for Amy or Alice?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that Guidant offers a full suite of solutions, so other companies as well, but we see a lot of combinations. There's financing out there that's unsecured, that's basically what you hear is stacking credit cards. That's a great way to get into business if you have good credit, a good exit strategy to pay that off at no retirement funds. So while that can't be layered with SBA as the equity injection, it is another viable source. But the most common, in addition to using a portfolio loan, which is those that are non-retirement funds, you can actually leverage your stock portfolio up to 80% of what's in that account. And that's a really popular way that people aren't really sure of as well. So let's say you've got $200,000 in Microsoft stock. You can actually leverage up to 80% of what's in that account for a flat one-time fee, and for franchise startup, you can defer payments up to 2 years. That's another great way to use as an equity injection for an SBA loan or standalone purchase. And then we've also got equipment leasing. So there is different ways you can put it together. It's just really up to us to do our job to listen to the client and make sure that we're putting them in the best cost of capital possible when they do go to open their business.
I think the most common one we see is probably the equipment leasing in combination with the SBA loan outside of the ROBS and the SBA loan. And one reason for that is somebody may have a large project and it's largely made up of equipment, but they don't necessarily have the equity injection to meet the percentage required. So say they don't have the 30% of 500, but maybe 200 of that's equipment, and they have 30% of the 300. If we go an equipment lease, that preserves a lot of liquidity. They don't have to bring that money up front, and now they can still get into business. They just have a little bit more debt on their hands.
Great. So, Amy or Mike, what are some current typical lender criteria for franchisees that you're seeing?
I can start with just kind of a general overview. The way that we pre-qualify people is really based off of what we call the 5 Cs. So they're looking at credit. Typically, we want to see a borrower around 680 plus. The SBA sets the minimum at 640. So this is, again, where we say SBA has their minimum, and then the banks are going to put their minimum on top of that. So usually about 680 plus is what we're looking for in terms of credit. If they've had past bankruptcies, foreclosures, short sales, things like that, usually we just want a bit of seasoning on it. So more than 3 years since any of those major delinquencies, and then we can typically start to help those people once they've recovered their scores. Outside of credit, they're looking for collateral. So while this is a government-backed loan, the lenders actually can't use their guarantee from the SBA as their collateral. So the SBA really encourages them to look for, 1, securing on the business assets, and 2, securing on any outside assets that the borrower brings, typically their home. So collateral is a big issue. Typically, lenders aren't supposed to decline a deal based on collateral, but we see it all the time. So collateral is a really hot topic. It's something that they're definitely looking to secure on that home, the equity, even if it's just for leverage purposes. We have capacity, which really talks about the cash flow. Mike kind of mentioned they like to see that outside income. This is talking about really global cash flow. Can the business support the debt of the SBA loan, and can the borrower, with their outside income, support their monthly bills so that they're not dragging the business down or looking to pull money out of that too soon? Character, so that's talking about experience. They're wanting to know the background of the franchise, the background of this borrower, to make sure that there isn't anything that's going to contradict SBA guidelines or the bank's internal policies around them being a successful operator. I can't remember if I did 5 or if I'm on 4 for the 5 Cs, but was that 4? So we covered character, collateral, capacity. Oh, capital, of course, sorry.
The most important
The most important one. So do you have the money to meet the minimum down payment requirement that the bank's looking for? On a startup, we typically say the average is about 30% that they're looking for. For an existing business, it could be somewhere between anywhere from 15 to 25%, depending on the transaction. But having the capital available is really kind of a go or no-go. If you don't have the money to meet that down payment requirement, you're really out of luck.
Maybe I can address an existing purchase.
Sure.
Because they're kind of symbiotic. When the transactions that I have focused on, which are business acquisitions, in some cases partner buyouts, we're looking at a lot of the same things. I kind of like to use a chair analogy where all 4 legs are of equal importance. Perhaps the one variable from our perspective would be outside collateral. So I have done deals where it is not fully collateralized, and the SBA requires us to take all available outside collateral, which is typically personal residence, when people have other real estate, at a point that we get to 85% loan to value. So we don't necessarily turn down a deal if there is no outside collateral. If they have it, then you're going to take that. But really the 3 key areas for someone buying a business would be that the business itself shows historic ability to service the proposed mortgage, along with the buyer's living needs. That can be a variable if someone is, if their requirements for salary are similar to the seller, then that's pretty easy to plug in. They may be more or less. That would affect the overall global cash flow of a deal. So we want to see that business has been successful and can support the proposed mortgage. Secondly, that the borrower has as close to direct industry management experience as possible. And so it's also important to look at someone's background to call out those elements that, insofar as they don't have direct industry management experience, what do they bring to the table that gives you a warm fuzzy that, yeah, they've got the skills to operate a business that they're interested in purchasing. And then the injection or down payment requirements for an existing business are actually a little bit more lenient from our standpoint than a startup, because generally a startup is 30% injection down payment, kind of the same term, different words for the same term, the money into the deal. We will do between 20 and 25% down payment injection from the borrower, and the seller can contribute to part of that. We always like to see that a buyer has skin in the game, but maybe a buyer, in order to retain operating capital after they close, they come in with 10-15%, seller carries back 10-15% on full standby for a couple of years, so they're accruing interest but no payments are made, and then you want to see the terms of that loan as favorable as possible for overall, for overall cash flow. I could give one quick example of a deal from last year that might help illustrate. It was an aftermarket truck parts manufacturing company that a gentleman was purchasing. Purchase price was $2.6 million. We did a loan for 2.1. It was not fully collateralized, either with business assets or even after taking his personal residence. But we did that deal based on cash flow, and he actually was in a completely unrelated business, but worked with distributors throughout the country, as does this manufacturer. So that was part of it. He had some history, family business in manufacturing. So we kind of culled those elements together. He had a good financial foundation of understanding financials. I kind of call it tough love. I work with buyers to put together a business plan and 2 years of month-by-month projections, along with some of the assumptions behind how they got to those. And that's challenging for a lot of people. But after the fact, I always find that it's valuable. People, I think, they may hate you going in, but they love you after you've made them do it, because it really helps them to understand what that path is and game plan. And the final comment on that deal, and I'll say this is an exception, not necessarily a rule, but we were able to close that transaction in 31 days from application to funding. I had worked with the borrower longer to get to the point where the clock starts ticking with an application, but one of the things that we were talking about earlier is the more motivated a buyer is, the more organized, the more receptive. I mean, it's at least 50% of the speed to closing of any deal, maybe more. People who, because life happens, perhaps they're less organized, they drag their feet, that deal is going to take longer. So,
great. So that is the end of our pre-prepared questions. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience, and it looks like we got one, but if I have others, if people don't. Kurt?
So Michael, getting back to this experience factor for the owner, I've had some cases where the owner is, I'll use an example of an attorney, county government, who wants to buy a construction business with an SBA loan. So there's some concerns there with regard to lack of experience. Ultimately, the bank that we used agreed, as long as there was an employment contract with the two employees.
That's a great point.
Is that the way to get around that?
I think that certainly does help to bridge, and frankly, even when there is some level of direct industry experience, I think that's wise, that the SBA will allow a seller to stay on for up to a year and assist. In many cases, it may be a matter of a few months. You know, I'm doing adult family care facilities where the seller will stay on, help make that transition. And I think it speaks to that one of the unknowns, no matter what the deal looks like, is what's that interaction going to be like after the deal closes between the new owner and staff. There could be any kind of variety of dynamics that could either work for them or against them. And certainly in fact, it just kind of occurred to me that that's one of the benefits of that direct industry experience, being able to talk the lingo, being able to really gain the respect, because an owner coming in can show that they've really been there, done that, and they're not really reinventing the wheel.
I've got a question if nobody else does. Mike, I know you've been involved a lot with SBA financing in real estate, which doesn't happen too often, especially at the startup level of a franchise, but I personally, in the first half of this year, had 2 resale deals that both involved real estate and the SBA. I'm just curious if, for those that aren't familiar with the SBA and real estate being involved with those kind of deals, if there's any insights or things that changed from doing the deal when real estate's involved?
Well, first I'd like to start out and give you my business card for those next couple of deals. I think over the years, and I will have been involved in SBA financing in August for 30 years, which is hard to believe. And certainly the SOP has changed over the years. I think the fundamental message in that particular aspect of SBA financing is very simple, is that the 2 programs that are available, the 7A and the 504, with regard to an existing business owner who at some point realizes that buying their own building has a range of benefits, near term, long term, is that they can, a qualified buyer can put as little as 10% down to acquire that commercial real estate if they're going to occupy 51% or more of an existing building. So it's that retention of operating capital that is a huge benefit. And even if it's an entry strategy where the 7A, for example, has 3 years of prepayment penalties, where after, let's say in 3 to 5 years, they refinance into a more conventional loan, perhaps additional collateral was necessary and they want to release that. It's just a tremendous opportunity, and one of the gratifying things of being in the business so long is that some of the people that I did loans for 20, 25 years, I know that they have retired, perhaps in larger part because of the ownership of that commercial real estate. So that's pretty neat to have contributed to that along the way. So, there's a spectrum where you have an all-cash buyer, and then you've got someone with no money. And the SBA realm is kind of that first quarter or third with real estate. It doesn't just pertain to people who don't have enough to do a conventional down payment, but maybe they want to retain that operating capital for moving costs, which are often underestimated, for minor tenant improvements that would otherwise delay the closing if it's a construction loan. Or the famous widget analogy. If you're making 50% on turning widgets, why would you tie that money up into a building that's appreciating at 3% per year, 3 to 5%? So that's the whole benefit, I think, of doing SBA financing for a business that's been around for, let's say 3 or more years. There's no SBA guideline. It's just showing that historic debt coverage ability.
Go ahead. All right, Jeff, and then Al.
Is there a preferred business plan format that you direct people to work on their numbers to prepare for that presentation?
Want to repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a preferred format for the business plan and also the financial projections? What we use, and what's really great resource, is the SBA website. They actually have the information on there and what they're looking for in a business plan. It'll break it out into each section and in each section what they're looking for, and it's a great tool. That's where we have formulated our template that we provide to our clients. That's where we'll send people to do that. There's also the SBDC and SCORE offices throughout the country that people can go to, sit down with somebody, and have them, from the FBA perspective, walk them through what they're looking for in these projections, because there are certain debt service coverage ratio guidelines that lenders are looking for, typically a 1.25 or higher, but most people have no idea what that means. So it's getting the information either from the website or sitting down with somebody that can walk you through what exactly they're looking for, and that's available either on the SBA website or in those SCORE or SBDC offices.
And can you, for those that don't know what SBD and SCORE stand for?
Oh, gosh. Small Business Development Center. I don't know the acronym for SCORE.
Service Corps of Retired Executives.
Yeah, and it's important to note that those services are offered at no cost, typically. So that's huge.
So my question is, it's pretty common in franchising for a successful first-time franchisee to want to up and reinvest in the business, say in year 2 or 3, if their first experience has been as good or better as they hope. They want to get another protected territory, open up another store. Is that round of funding easier, and do they wrap their first loan, or are they both standalone? I mean, what's common? What's the experience on somebody reinvesting in another territory and hopefully doing that every 3 or 4 years?
Anytime someone has a successful track record, that's going to make a big difference. And, then really it becomes a projection-based deal where you're still using a lot of the same components, business plan for the expansion, the projections, and the like. What do you guys do?
As far as the fundamental security on the first loan, I mean, you just up the credit limit, becomes one master loan with 2 separate assets, or is it 2 different loans?
I think typically it's going to be 2 different loans.
When we see it, it's going to be 2 separate loans because the usage of the loan is different, and depending on the structure as well, some people will structure each location as an LLC. That LLC is now our borrower, so they would have different borrowers potentially because the SBA loan is going to be in the name of that business. So usually it is going to be a separate loan, and then in terms of the qualifications or whether or not that's easier to obtain on that second location, third location, typically it will be. If you have the financials of the business to show that you've got the track record, you've made this work before, that's a lot less risk for the bank to take on. And especially if that bank has done your loan for number 1 and hold collateral for that loan in number 1, that collateral is going to now apply to the second loan. So they're not going to be looking for as much collateral. A lot of times the equity injection percentage can be lower as well because they know you've already got skin in the game on the first deal. So typically it's going to be an easier road, especially if you're going with the same bank who financed the first one.
So my understanding is it's 2 separate loans.
Yes.
So you have 2 different amortizations going there.
Correct. Yes.
And I'll just add on to that, when I talked earlier about the education, we do work with a lot of franchise concepts that sell multi-packs, so they're selling 3, 5, 10 locations at a time, and although they've got a development schedule, we see people all the time that come to us and they have a lot of money in their retirement funds, but we understand they're going to open location 2, 3, 4, 5 down the road. So our advice to them is leave some of that retirement in your pot because as you're doing locations 2 and 3, you just look that much more appealing to the SBA as well.
It's also, you want to be cognizant of loan amounts, and the 7A is up to $5 million, and we're probably talking quite a bit lower than that. But if someone's tapped out, that's why that cycle and a good relationship with one's bank is important, because you may, for someone who's really growing, they want to transition those SBA guaranteed loans into conventional, and that takes a minimum of a 3-year track record.
What's the difference in the interest rates?
Candidly, I think that the conventional terms, the rates are going to be a bit lower. You know, there's such a range, it's hard to quote a difference. But, you know, listen, there are always trade-offs. One thing, and you guys may encounter this, a lot of people come to the table having never done SBA financing, commercial financing. They think, well, can I get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage like on my house? And it's apples and oranges. And, you know, a 30-year fixed rate would be the perfect loan. But when you're in that realm of conventional and commercial financing, there's always trade-offs. And, you know, careful what you ask for. The lowest rate may have the most onerous prepayment penalty. And one thing I've seen is, you know, people need flexibility. They don't think that they may, and, you know, 3-5 years down the road, something changes, a divorce, a partnership ends, the economy changes, and they want and need that flexibility. And oops, all they cared about was the lowest interest rate, but they paid a bigger price down the road. So you really have to take into all those variables into consideration.
Caitlin, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to the business plan, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges as a franchise consultant, because what comes first, the chicken or the egg? So the candidate says, well, the only way I can do my business plan is my rent's going to get eaten, but I can't do my rent if I don't have guaranteed the money. So it's that fine line that we watch, and then we can't look at it. We can't help them with the business plan, and we can't look at it or anything. So but having a template, it's nice to have a template. You can just say, there you go, and then they can go to franchisees. It is, you know, I had one candidate took him he was determined he was going to do it. He'd never done a business plan in his life. He was determined he was going to do it. It took him months to do it. Finally did.
And I think that's one area when we talk about franchise financing where they have a big step ahead of somebody looking at an independent concept, because for the most part, these lenders are very familiar with the franchise concept, and if they're not, it's very easy to find a lot of information. So the business plan at that point becomes more of a formality than something that's really going to make or break the deal. So typically when I'm working with a franchisee and they're stressing about the business plan, I kind of walk them through that and let them know, you know, this isn't going to make or break your deal. It's going to include important information about how you're going to run your business, who your competition is in your area, things like that, but it's not going to make or break your deal, and it shouldn't be something that you're stressing out. They're not going to decline you if it's not 50 pages long and beautiful. We're talking 5 to 7 pages. You can throw some pictures in there. You know, it's not something that they're really going to decline you based off, at least in our experience. I don't know, Mike, if you have
well, yeah, less is more. I tell people we don't want a leather-bound Tolstoy novel. I mean, my credit people don't have that kind of attention span. So I think less is often more, and really hitting the right points. And, you know, having something, it can be a simple Word document. I don't think that the fluff part really adds a tremendous amount of value.
Melissa?
So does size come into play from your guys' size of the loan is what I mean. So, for example, our franchise fee is relatively small, $25,000 franchise fee. We have no building, no assets to buy, you know, maybe initial investment under $45,000. Does the 30%, all of the year 5 fees still come into play when you're looking at a much smaller loan?
It definitely shrinks the pool of lenders out there. We work with a ton of different banks, and each one has kind of a minimum criteria for the loan amount that they'd go down to. And for the most part, you know, we have one lender that'll go down to $25,000, another that's down to $50,000, another that's $75,000, and the most part it's $150,000 is their minimum, and then others it's $250,000, $350,000. So the bigger the deal, the bigger the pot of lenders out there that you're going to see. Typically the smaller transactions are going to be more suited to maybe a local community lender, somebody like that who is more used to seeing these kind of micro loans than your big national players who are really trying to make as much money as possible. But the credit criteria is still going to be the same. It's just going to be on a much smaller basis, so it would probably be a bit easier to qualify for that because you don't have to have quite as much to to the table as you would for a $250,000 loan.
And that's also where, being a little creative and recognizing that there are, when you get into that smaller realm, lines of credit. I know that Umpqua will provide unsecured line of credit up to $50,000. There are a lot of other options. Perhaps credit cards are not necessarily the best way to go, but hopefully it doesn't preclude on some level that person who is getting, who isn't trying to get bank financing per se, of not going through some of the same steps of due diligence or preparation rather for the purchase of that franchise. Still, that's the tough love part.
Well, we are about at the end of our time, but if there's one last question, we can fit it in, but looks like we're good. So I want to thank all of our panelists for giving us their time and expertise, and thank everyone else for attending. And this program is ended.